Doctor of Digital.
And welcome to Love Letters. Love Letters are a collection of love stories of people get lost, get crazy, and basically ended in the name of love. The Restless Heart. Why can't find love in a laboratory? Love Letters Part 3.
In an era where loneliness has become a silent epidemic and dating feels like navigating a minefield of transactional challenge exchanges, Shadid Hamid's recent article, Men Are Struggling to Find Love, Here's Why, is a recent analysis of the male struggle for connection, has exposed a raw cultural nerve. We've attempted to solve the crisis of the heart using the cold language of the laboratory and the therapy couch, yet young men remain caught in a perfect storm, neurologically isolated and spiritually adrift. By trading the covenantal framework of the sanctuary for the contractual model of the dating marketplace, the sovereign self has been left in a state of chronic relational dysregulation. As Augustine of Hippo famously observed in the 4th century, our hearts are restless until they find rest in thee. This restlessness isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature of our relational anthropology. When the amygdala is constantly scanning for red flags in a digital minefield, it cannot enter the state of physiological calm required for true intimacy. Today, Daniel and I will look past the modern metrics of market value to the wisdom of the ante-Nicene fathers and the radical communal ethics of the early church. We're moving beyond the 1957 desperation of the coasters searching, looking for love in every highway, byway, and ditch to rediscover a love in the ruins that offers a robust architecture for human flourishing in an age of fragmented souls.
Fragmented soul indeed, Mr. Meg. Hamid's article paints a picture of a widespread male loneliness and romantic failure. What's actually happening here? And thus, early Christian thought help us understand this crisis.
The statistics Hamid presents are genuinely alarming. Increasing numbers of young men report having no close friends, declining rates of sexual activity among young adults, and a growing cohort has simply withdrawn from romantic pursuit altogether. This isn't just about incels or fringe communities, it's a mainstream phenomenon affecting ordinary young men across demographic lines. Hamid suggests several culprits: the rise of online dating that creates brutal winner take all dynamics, feminist critiques that have left men uncertain about appropriate behavior, economic precarity that delays traditional markers of adulthood, and a broader cultural shift that has devalued traditional masculine traits. The early Christians would recognize much of this landscape, though, expressed in different terms. They too lived in a world of profound social dislocation. The Pax Romana had disrupted traditional tribal and familial structures. Urbanization was creating anonymous crowds rather than intimate communities. And philosophical movements like Stoicism were responding to widespread anxiety about meaning and purpose. Into this context, the Christian movement offered something radical: a vision of human identity not rooted in social status, sexual prowess, or conventional masculine achievement, but in being made in the image of God and called into transformative community. Consider how the Apostle Paul addresses the Corinthian church, a community rife with sexual confusion and social anxiety. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul doesn't simply prescribe rules for dating and marriage, he fundamentally reframes the entire question. He writes, I wish that all were as myself am, but each has its own gift, and from God, one of one kind and one of another. This is revolutionary. Both celibacy and marriage are described as charisms, gifts from God, vocations of equal dignity. The single man isn't a failure waiting to become successful through marriage. He may well be living out his particular calling with excellence. This is precisely what our contemporary discourse lacks. Hamid's article, while insightful about symptoms, operates within an assumed framework where romantic and sexual success are necessary components of male flourishing. The early Christians would challenge this assumption at its root. Gregory of Nyssa, writing in the late 4th century, argued in On Virginity that the unmarried life actually freed one for a different kind of love, not lesser, but in some ways more expansive, less possessive, more capable of universal concern. He wasn't denigrating marriage. Gregory himself was married before entering religious life after his wife's death, but rather expanding our imagination for what constitutes a flourishing human life. The loneliness epidemic, then, might be partly a crisis of imagination. We've inherited from secular modernity a narrowed vision in which romantic partnership is the primary, perhaps only path to intimacy, belonging, and adult identity. When that path becomes blocked or difficult, we experience not just disappointment, but existential panic because we placed all our eggs in one basket. The early Christian vision was more capacious. You could flourish through deep friendships, the philia, Aristotle praised, through spiritual community, through mentorship relationships, through family bonds, and yes, through romantic love, but not only through romantic love. Ignatius of Antioch, writing in the early second century as he traveled to his martyrdom in Rome, sent flowers that letters were overflowing with affection to various Christian communities. His language is ardent, intimate, emotionally vulnerable in ways that might make modern readers uncomfortable. My love has been crucified, he writes to the Romans, and elsewhere speaks of being bound to his brothers and sisters in chains of affection. These weren't romantic relationships, but they were clearly relationships of profound emotional significance, combating the isolation that might otherwise have defined a prisoner's final journey. The psychological research Hamid cites about male loneliness would have resonated with early Christian pastors like John Chrysostom, whose homilies in 4th century Antioch frequently addressed the spiritual dangers of isolation. Chrysostom observed that wealthy men, surrounded by servants and supplicants, were most often profoundly lonely because they lacked relationships of genuine mutuality. He urged his congregants towards authentic friendship, quoting Ecclesiastes 4 9 through 10. Two are better than one, for if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. What's particularly relevant here is that Chrysostom wasn't just making this argument. The early church actually created social structures to embody it. The Christian community offered practices of hospitality, common meals, the agape feast, networks of mutual aid, and intentional spiritual friendships that worked against social isolation. These weren't programs or interventions, they were woven into the fabric of what it meant to be a Christian. Modern psychological research on loneliness, particularly the work of John Capiapo, has demonstrated that the quality of our relationships matters more than the quantity, and perceived isolation is as physically dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The early Christians intuited this. Their solution wasn't simply to push everyone into marriage, though they valued marriage highly, but to create thick communities where multiple forms of meaningful relationship could flourish simultaneously. Here's where I want to push back gently on Hamid's framing. The article treats male romantic failure primarily as a problem of access. If only the dating market weren't so skewed, if only men had better social skills, if only economic conditions improved, then men would achieve a romantic success and therefore solve their loneliness. This framework keeps us trapped in thinking about relationships primarily in market terms, as goods to be acquired. The early Christian alternative is more radical. It suggests the prior question is not, how do I get a relationship, but how do I become the kind of person capable of genuine love? This is a question of character formation, not strategic optimization. Augustine of Hippo, whose confession reads in part as a spiritual memoir of disordered desire gradually being reordered, famously prayed, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." His point wasn't that human love is unimportant. Augustine valued friendship intensely and wrote movingly about it, but that misplaced desire that makes an idol of romantic fulfillment, will always disappoint. The loneliness epidemic might be, at its deepest level, a spiritual crisis of disordered loves. The Roman world that the early Christians inhabited was, in many ways, as sexually confused and relationally fractured as our own. The philosopher Epictetus, a near contemporary of Paul, wrote extensively about the anxiety produced by desiring things outside one's control, including other people's affections. His Stoic solution was to train oneself to desire only what's within one's power, achieving apatheia or freedom from passion. But Christianity offered something different, not freedom from desire, but transformation of desire. The goal wasn't to stop wanting love, but to learn what to want rightly, to pursue it vigorously, and to recognize that even legitimate human loves must be ordered under love of God. This distinction matters immensely for men experiencing the frustrations Hamid describes. The Stoic path, essentially lowering expectations and protecting yourself through emotional detachment, is one response to romantic disappointment. We see versions of in contemporary movements like the MGTOW, men going their own way, where men consciously withdraw from pursuing women. But this path, while it may reduce immediate pain, also forecloses the possibility of genuine connection. It's a defensive posture that mistakes invulnerability for virtue. The Christian path is harder but more hopeful. It acknowledges desire as good, as part of how God made us, while also recognizing that desire needs healing and formation. This means neither suppressing your longing for companionship nor allowing that longing to become an all consuming obsession that distorts your personality and relationships. It means learning to hold desire with open hands, present to it, honest about it, but not enslaved by it. Basil of Caesarea, in his long rules for monastic communities, wrote extensively about the passions and their proper ordering. He recognized that young men, the monasteries were largely male, came to religious life carrying powerful desires for sex, for status, for comfort, for control. Basil's approach wasn't to shame those desires or demand their instant extinction, but to provide a communal context and set of practices through which they could gradually be transformed. Men worked together, prayed together, ate together, confessed their struggles to each other, and over years, not days or weeks, found their desires being reshaped. What might a contemporary Basilian approach to the male loneliness crisis look like? It would start by taking men's desires seriously rather than dismissing them as shallow or toxic. Yes, you want romantic companionship, sexual intimacy, the affirmation of being chosen by someone you admire. These aren't shameful desires, they're human. But it would then ask, are you ready for what you desire? Have you cultivated the virtues, patience, generosity, emotional intelligence, self control, the capacity to truly see another person rather than just projecting your needs onto them that make genuine partnership possible? And crucially, it would insist that this formation cannot happen in isolation. You need other men who are further along the path, who can mentor you. You need peers who are struggling with similar challenges, who can provide solidarity and accountability. You need a community that offers you dignity and purpose beyond romantic success, so that your entire sense of self isn't dependent on finding a partner. The early Christians built these communities intentionally. We've largely lost them, and their absence contributes significantly to the crisis Hamid identifies. The male loneliness crisis is real and painful, but it's also an invitation to recover a richer Christian anthropology that sees human flourishing as possible through multiple forms of love and community, not solely dependent on romantic success. In conclusion, the early Christians faced their own version of social dislocation and responded by creating communities of belonging that addressed the whole person, not just their romantic aspirations, but their deeper need to be known, loved, and called towards a noble purpose larger than themselves.
Mr. Mick, you mentioned disordered desire and Augustine's recorded affection. Can you unpack what early Christians believe about desire itself? Is wanting romance actually the problem?
This question cuts to the heart of early Christian moral psychology, which was far more sophisticated than our contemporary therapeutic culture often gives it credit for. The early Christians didn't reach that and teach that desire itself was problematic. That was the era of various Gnostic movements they vigorously opposed. Rather, they taught that desire needs formation, that we must learn to want rightly, to love appropriately, to direct our longings toward worthy objects in proper proportion. Let's start with the biblical foundation. In Matthew 5:28, Jesus famously says, "Everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." This has often been misread as a harsh condemnation of sexual feeling itself. But look more carefully at what Jesus is doing. He's directing attention to the interior life, to the desires and intentions that precede action. The Sermon on the Mount consistently moves ethics from external compliance toward internal transformation. Jesus is saying that virtue isn't just about controlling behavior, it's about forming desire, shaping the heart. The early church fathers took this seriously and developed extensive theologies of desire. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the late second century, distinguished between disordered desire or lust and desire that can be sanctified and directed toward God and neighbor. Clement wasn't prudish. He wrote an entire treatise, The Instructor, giving practical advice about marriage, including sexual relations, treating them as good gifts needed wise stewardship. But here's what's fascinating. Clement taught that the problem isn't desire's intensity, but its direction and discipline. He would have recognized the phenomenon Hamid describes: young men consumed by romantic longing, frustrated by unmet desires, sometimes turning that frustration into resentment or withdrawal. But Clement's diagnosis would be subtle. Desire for intimacy and partnership isn't wrong, but when it becomes desperate, grasping, when it seeks to possess rather than genuinely know another person, when it's driven more by ego needs than authentic love, that's when desire has gone wrong. Gregory of Nyssa offers perhaps the most profound early Christian reflection on desire in his commentary on the Song of Songs. Gregory reads this biblical love poem allegorically, as was common in his era, as depicting the soul's desire for God, but he doesn't therefore deny its erotic dimension. Rather, he transforms our understanding of eros itself. For Gregory, eros is that restless energy that drives us beyond ourselves, that makes us dissatisfied with the status quo, that propels us towards union with something greater. This erotic energy, he argues, is built into human nature by God and is fundamentally good, but it must be educated. The contemporary dating crisis Hamid describes involves desire that hasn't been formed, or worse, that has been malformed by pornography, by transactional views of relationships, by the gamification of romance through dating apps, by cultural messages that reduce intimacy to physical satisfaction. Early Christian formation practices assume that desire, left untended, would indeed become disordered. That's why monastic traditions develop rigorous practices of asceticism, not because the body was evil, but because the passions needed training like an athlete trains muscles. Augustine's journey, chronicled in the Confessions, illustrates this transformation. His early life was marked by sexual relationships he described as driven by libido dominandi, the lust for domination, the desire to possess and consume. Even his long term relationship with his unnamed concubine, though seemingly stable, was fundamentally disordered in Augustine's later view because it was about his satisfaction, his needs, his desires, without the mutual self gift and permanence of true marriage. His conversion wasn't from sexuality to asexuality. Augustine affirmed marriage as a good throughout his life, but from disordered desire to the possibility of rightly ordered love. What would Augustine say to the young man whose experience of love has been shaped primarily by pornography and swiping through dating app profiles? He'd likely say, "You've trained yourself to desire wrongly. You've learned to view potential partners as objects for assessment and consumption rather than as subjects, as whole persons created in God's image. The work before you isn't primarily about finding someone, but about becoming someone capable of love." This connects to contemporary psychological research in illuminating ways. Attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, demonstrates that our capacity for healthy adult relationships is shaped by early relational experiences. Those with anxious or avoidant attachment patterns struggle with intimacy, either clinging desperately or maintaining defensive distance. Healing requires what psychologists call earned security, the patient rewiring of relational patterns through new, healthy relationships, often beginning with a therapeutic relationship. The early Christians would recognize this process. What modern psychology calls earned security, they called sanctification, the lifelong process of being conformed to Christ's image, which includes learning to love as Christ loves. This wasn't quick or easy. The desert fathers and mothers, whose third and fourth century monastics who withdrew to the Egyptian wilderness, spent decades wrestling with what they called logismoi, intrusive thoughts and disordered desires. Their spiritual disciplines weren't about repression, but about patient transformation. Evagrius Ponticus, a fourth century monastic theologian, taught that lust, porneia, was one of eight troubling thoughts that needed healing. His prescribed remedy wasn't sheer willpower, but a combination of practices: fasting to train bodily appetites, prayer to reorient desire toward God, manual labor to channel restless energy, and perhaps most importantly, confession and guidance from a spiritual elder. Evagrius understood that disordered desire couldn't be healed in isolation. It required community, accountability, and alternative practices that gradually retrain the passions. The desert tradition also recognized what we might call the ecology of desire, how different passions feed each other and how healing one area affects others. Evagrius observed that gluttony often preceded lust, as overindulgence in food stirred up bodily passions more generally. This holistic understanding meant that someone struggling with sexual frustration might need to examine not just their romantic life, but their relationship with pleasure, consumption, and self control across multiple domains. Now, let's bring this to conversation with Hamid's analysis. He notes that many young men have withdrawn from the dating market entirely. What social scientists call herbivore men in Japan are men going their own way in Western context. Some of this withdrawal reflects national rational calculation. If the cost, rejection, humiliation, unclear rules exceed the probable benefits, why play the game? But early Christian wisdom suggests something deeper might be happening. Profound disillusionment, yes, but also an unformed desire that doesn't know what it is actually seeking. C.S. Lewis, drawing on early Christian tradition, wrote in The Weight of Glory, "It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half hearted creatures, fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea." The men withdrawing from dating may think they're being realistic, protecting themselves, or rationally opting out of a bad market. But from a Christian perspective, they may be actually settling for mud pies, retreating into video games, pornography, parasocial relationships with online personalities, or simply numbing resignation because they lack the imagination, formation, and community support to pursue genuine love, which is always costly and risky. Early Christians faced temptations to withdrawal as well. The Stoic philosopher, popular in their time, taught apatheia, freedom from passion, emotional invulnerability achieved through detachment. The Christians rejected this. Yes, they warned against enslaving passions, but their goal wasn't detachment, but transformation. They wanted desire to be healed and elevated, not eliminated. This is why martyrs could face death with joy, not because they felt nothing, but because their loves had been reordered around what they believed was ultimate. John Chrysostom preached powerful sermons about marriage in late 4th century Constantinople, a city unlike our own with its celebration of wealth, status, and erotic display. He told young men that the measure of readiness for marriage wasn't economic success or social standing, but character, specifically the ability to love sacrificially. He urged them to see potential wives not as trophies or servants, but as partners in the spiritual life, equals in dignity before God, even if Roman society denied this. Chrysostom also addressed the frustration of prolonged singleness. He acknowledged that sexual desire was powerful and that prolonged celibacy was difficult. He didn't minimize this, but he counseled young men to use the waiting period productively, to develop friendships, to serve the church community, to pursue learning and virtue, to cultivate the practices of prayer and self discipline that would serve them throughout life, regardless of whether they married. In conclusion, the single years weren't wasted time or a prison sentence to be endured. They were a distinct season with their own opportunities for growth.
So, Mr. Mick, as we wrap, what are the practical and pastoral applications for today?
Well, here is the pastoral application for today. If you're a young man struggling in the dating market, early Christian wisdom doesn't offer you pickup techniques or strategic advantages. It offers you something harder but more transformative, and that is an invitation to examine your desires themselves. What are you actually seeking? Is it genuine intimacy and partnership? Or is it validation, ego satisfaction, sexual gratification, social status, or relief from loneliness? These latter desires aren't entirely wrong. They're human. But when they drive the search for relationship, they tend to produce either desperate grasping or cynical withdrawal. The formation of desire requires what the Christian tradition calls disciplined practice. This might include periods of deliberate solitude and celibacy to break unhealthy patterns. spiritual direction or therapy to understand your relational wounds and patterns, immersion in communities that model healthy relationships, practices of service that train you to notice and respond to others' needs rather than constantly focusing on your own, and exposure to beauty, truth, and goodness that expands your imagination for what love might be. Maximus the Confessor, a 7th century monk and theologian, taught that the passions themselves aren't evil, but are energies that have been misdirected by sin. Anger, for instance, should be directed at injustice, not at people who frustrate us. Sexual desire should be directed toward genuine union in marriage, not toward using another person for satisfaction. The spiritual life involves not killing these passions, but redirecting them toward their proper objects. This is deeply hopeful. Your desire for romantic love isn't a problem to be solved, but an energy to be channeled. Consider what the Jewish wisdom tradition, which deeply influenced early Christianity, taught about desire. Proverbs personifies wisdom as a woman calling out to young men, inviting them to desire her above all other pursuits. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom, the sage writes, for she is more profitable than silver and yields better returns than gold. The point isn't that romantic love is unimportant, but that the young man must first be captured by love of wisdom, truth, and goodness. When his desires are properly ordered in this way, he becomes capable of genuine love of another person rather than mere neediness dressed up as romance. That Song of Songs, the most erotic of biblical books, repeatedly includes the refrain, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. Generations of interpreters have puzzled over this curious command. One reading is that love, eros, has its own proper timing, and there's danger in forcing it prematurely, whether through cultural pressure or personal desperation. The young man must become ready for love, must develop the character and maturity to sustain it before pursuing it aggressively. Otherwise, he risks damaging both himself and any partner he might find. This patience and formation connects to the theological virtue of hope. Hope isn't optimism that everything will work out according to your timeline and preferences. Rather, hope is confidence that God is faithful, that your life has meaning and purpose regardless of immediate circumstances, and that patient faithfulness will be honored even if not in ways you currently imagine. For the man frustrated by years of romantic unsuccess, hope means continuing to prepare himself for love while remaining open to the possibility that God's plan for his flourishing might not match his own expectations. The early Christians teach us that desire itself is good, a divine gift, but it requires lifelong formation. And the first work is not finding the right person, but becoming capable of rightly loving any person you might find. This formation happens through spiritual practices, authentic community, mentorship, and the patient, often difficult work of examining and redirecting our longings toward their proper ends. In conclusion, the reward isn't guaranteed romantic success, but something deeper, becoming a person capable of genuine love, which is worthwhile regardless of whether you find a partner.
Very well said, Mr. Meg, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. Thank you, thank you. Love has always resisted containment. In an era of neurochemistry, data analytics, and algorithmic matchmaking, we are tempted to believe that mystery of love can be reduced to hormones, compatibility scores, and predictive behavior models. So, Mr. Mick, would you like to plug in something?
Thanks for the opportunity. Write the book, grow the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn. GMIC, the Doctor of Digital Smith, PhD. Listen to the Doctor of Digital podcast and also pick up a couple volumes I have on Amazon. That's Burning America and On Track Ian Hunter.
Yes, people, I support Mr. Mick, the Doctor of Digital, and please do listen to our other podcasts, Music 101, Sex 101, and of course, Love Letters, as well as Mental Health 101. So, Mr. Mick, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Until next time, Deus Volt.
Some people, see you soon.